Okay, shall I
Okay,
fire
go
away?
ahead, Doug.
Okay, I'm Doug Allen, Vice President Parks. I have no video. My introduction here right now is for Andrea Ulrich, who is the Director of Legislation and Regulations with the Ministry of Government Relations. And this will be regarding, I understand that preparing amendments to the municipalities regulations regarding hamlets. I do believe she has a co-presenter in this by the name of Chelsea. I'll hand it over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Yes, so I do have Chelsea Lehner with me today here. She is the analyst that's been working on this file for the past several months. And this is actually a project that I started over a year ago, and then due to various pressures was put on hold. So I know there will be some attendees here today who have heard about this before, and this is indeed the same project, the amendments that we're looking at. So yeah, just a little bit of background is what I'll start with then. How did we get here? Why are we looking at amending the regulations for organized hamlets? As a ministry, we know that there's been a history of disputes between organized hamlets and RMs, and part of the reason for that is that there's some lack of clarity in the regulations, especially around roles and which party has which responsibility, especially in a few key areas. So we've been looking at amending these regulations to provide better clarity for that. In spring 2020, there were amendments passed to the Municipalities Act where there was just a few small amendments to the sections on organized hamlets, but mostly what we did there is add regulation making authority so that we would be able to address the details in regulations. In early summer 2021, I organized some focus groups with a number of organized hamlet board members, some RM council members and RM administrators who have organized hamlets in their RMs. And then since then, we released a focus group report, but then the project was on hold for a little while, and we're now just starting to look at it again. One of the things the focus groups helped us do is define the problem. So the issue here is that roles and responsibilities for rural municipalities and their respective organized hamlets are not clearly defined in the regulations, as I mentioned, which leads to conflict and misunderstandings of the purpose of organized hamlets. So that's one of the things we took a deeper dive into is, what are organized hamlets? Why do they exist? And what's the value there? So how can we preserve that if we're looking at clarifying roles? The next one, right? So out of the discussions that came from the focus groups and just looking at what is the purpose of organized hamlets, what we're proposing is to move to a board-like structure. If you look at organized hamlet boards, they are called boards, but in some cases, the way they function doesn't resemble boards right now. So what we'd be doing is saying, okay, an organized hamlet should be working like a board. And boards have various different iterations, but generally they have policies that they adhere to in how they operate. They have their own policies, governance policies, and operational policies, and this is how we will function as a board. So that's one way of being able to account for the diversity we saw across the board with organized hamlets. So those board policies might look very different in a large organized hamlet versus a small one, a seasonal one versus a year-round one, things like that. But then it's under the control of the board to determine certain things on how they operate and function. The second component is the RM policies regarding processes for organized hamlets. So this offers some clarity around things like submitting a budget and how that budget is approved. And then, once that budget is approved, how expenditures are made, how projects are managed, etc. The RM does have the final say in many of these things, but if it isn't clear on what processes are being followed, then there can be misunderstanding and conflict that could arise from that. The third area is a written agreement. Again, this would account for diversity in practices across the province. Not every organized hamlet looks the same. Not every RM has the same kind of relationship with its organized hamlets. It might have 1, it might have 10. So you're going to see different things that need to be taken into account. But certain things, like the percentage of taxes that go back into the organized hamlet account, for example, certain things would become part of this written agreement. And so that would require both parties to work together to have a written agreement. And then that would provide absolute clarity in terms of, okay, now there's a dispute down the road about that. Well, we have it here in the written agreement, and this is what we both agreed to. So that written agreement would, again, allow for different practices, but would offer that stability and predictability. The fourth area is what happens when there is a dispute, and how can we improve the process there for dispute resolution. So the key thing we'd be looking at doing there is introducing mediation as a required step. Mediation can be a lower cost solution to arrive at an outcome that's better for both parties, and it can be a shorter timeline. Of course, nobody likes having things end up at the courts. The dispute appeal boards themselves as well, we don't have a lot of information on, and there isn't a lot of structure around that. So we'd be looking at put some structure around those appeal boards, but also introducing mediation to hopefully, again, prevent those disputes from getting to that point. And the fifth one is to add some conflict of interest requirements for organized hamlet board members. We did a lot of work for municipal councillors in 2016, you may recall, for those of you familiar with it. And at that time, we kind of said, well, we'll figure out what that looks like for hamlets later on. And so now we'd be doing kind of a scaled back version of those conflict of interest requirements that would apply to organized hamlet board members. Of course, they aren't decision makers themselves, but they have a significant amount of influence and input into decisions that are made. So it is appropriate to have clear guidelines for that. At this point, I will pass it over to Chelsea to explain some of the more details around that.
Okay, so this slide here, this shows the proposed overview of the regulatory framework that Andrea was talking about in the slides previously. So we're going to start with the blue box on the left-hand side. So this blue box outlines the policies that the OH board would be responsible for creating. And this includes things like public notice policies, board meeting procedures, duties of the board secretary, and remuneration of board members. If we go to the yellow box, which would be on your right-hand side, this outlines the policies that the RM Council would be responsible for establishing. So this includes things like if there's a new OH that's created, organizing that first meeting of the newly formed OH, budget-related matters, as well as procedures for determining any kind of cost sharing for shared services, format and timing of joint meetings. And if we go to the center box, which is the green box, this is the written agreement. So this would outline the agreement between the OH board and the RM Council. And this is where there would be overlap in terms of responsibilities or authorities between the two, and that they would be defined in the written agreement. And what the proposed regulations currently has is that their regulations would determine that a written agreement must exist and specify what needs to be contained. But then it would be up to the Hamlet board and the RM Council to create that agreement and put the information in there accordingly. So things that would be included in there would be communication protocol between the two, frequency of joint meetings, percentage of levies and taxes, mill rate, if there's any differences, that would be documented within the written agreement, and policies for capital planning for projects specifically with the OH. In the bottom gray box there, that's the information that outlines the items that would be included in the regulations. So this split into sort of two categories. The first one is things that would be for the public interest. So like the annual general meeting, for example, the annual reports, voter eligibility, or any publicly available documents would be included within the regulations. The sort of second bucket would be to help address any confusion or gaps that exists within the Act. So that could include things like financial rules when it comes to the Hamlet account, clearer procedures for dispute resolution. So like Andrea mentioned, having mediation as the first step if a disagreement arises to help sort of solve the issue beforehand, and conflict of interest requirements for board members. So those things are all captured within this proposed model that we want to chat with you all about today. And if I just go to my next slide.
I'm honestly not sure. Like I can't see it.
Let's just stop sharing. Okay, I'm just going to tell you about what the next slide says. So the next slide talks about what the desired outcomes would be for the proposed model, and what the intent is that this proposed model would help to improve the relationship between OHs and RMs by clarifying the responsibilities of both. It would also clarify the role of the RM and the OH when we're talking about governance and decision-making power. And that this board, this new proposed model, would result in a high-functioning board that acts as partners with the RM Council when looking at the unique needs of the OH residents. So that's okay. There we go. There we go. There's our desired outcomes. So that's what the intent is with this proposed model that we're trying to get out. And what we want to continue to do here is get your feedback on the discussion paper that was presented with you today, that was presented with you before, and get your thoughts and feedback on that. And I'll just hand it back to Andrea to wrap up before we jump into that discussion.
Thanks. Sorry. Thank you for your patience too, as we're, come up against unexpected technical glitches. Yeah. So right now, what we're looking at is there support for this new model with the OH board model, and if people like what they see, right, the discussion paper talks about it in a lot more detail, and that can be distributed and shared. Then what potential training and education would you like to see developed that would help organized hamlets and RMs adjust to these new changes? So that's what we're looking at right now. And the next step would also be able to distribute some proposed wording for the actual regulation amendments. This is what it would look like in detail. And some people might be interested in digging into that and some not, but we're definitely interested in hearing feedback from all parties. We've also started consulting with the SARM on this, of course, because there's impact for RMs. And we've also sent this out to the people who participated in the focus groups last summer for their specific feedback. So yeah, right now we would welcome any comments, questions, and you'll also see at the bottom there an email address that you can submit any written comments to after today. So I believe there's someone facilitating questions.
Yes, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. People can either raise their hand or type a question. Oh, we have Sherry Jimmy has her hand up. Unmute yourself, Sherry, and go ahead and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Sherry.
Okay. First of all, Andrea and team, I have to commend you on the discussion report and this discussion paper. As being a member of one of the focus groups, I really think you have captured and articulated really well what we heard in the focus group sessions, at least the one that I had attended, and put it in a very clear and concise format. And I really like the regulatory framework diagram that you've come up with and the definition of the balance of power with the roles and responsibilities. So I've had the opportunity to read the entire focus group report and appreciate your presentation today. And we'll go over it with our administration and council as well and provide you with some feedback. But at this point, I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. I've heard you speak about organized hamlets a few times, Sherry, and really admired your experience and expertise there. So that was also part of the input I had going into that. So that's good initial feedback, and I look forward to getting more detailed feedback from you as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Andrea. Gary Dixon on this online here. Just a couple of things. I went through your presentation here beforehand, and I think it needs a lot more detail in it, which you were probably coming up with. But you know, what things like what would constitute a conflict of interest? Things like.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to just stop there and I can actually respond to that? Or... I'll take that as a yes. Yeah, so conflict of interest is actually a conflict of interest just as it is defined in the Act. What we would be specifying is what kind of actions organized hamlet board members would have to take. So similar to council meetings, declare I have a conflict of interest and leave the meeting. Then it would be recorded in the minutes and so on. And so when we distribute proposed wording, you'll see exactly what applies and what doesn't, but it's just in terms of the actions required of them where it would be maybe different, but the conflict of interest itself, it remains as it's defined in the Municipalities Act.
Yeah, I guess I have a more specific thing. Like, would a councillor in a rural municipality be in a conflict on if he's a member of the organized hamlet board?
Not necessarily. He would have a conflict if he was inappropriately furthering the private interest of himself or another person, being a private interest, right? Being a council member is a public interest, and so it's not inherently a conflict.
Okay. Just on another note, when an organized hamlet is preparing a budget, should that budget be approved by the ratepayers prior to going to the RM, or is the onus on the organized hamlet board to prepare it themselves?
So those types of things could be worked out in policy and in that agreement. You know, it's not going to get into really high, like nitty-gritty detail on some of those things because we know that there's different practices there. But the RM and the OH could say, okay, this is the steps we agree that we'll go through. For example, maybe that budget is reviewed at an AGM or something like that. Maybe it's not. That's the type of detail we actually want to leave out of the regulations in order to have more control at the local level. So the regulations would simply say, you know, what the council must approve and how expenditures must be made from the budget and things like that, very high level, not getting into the detailed process of approval. I'm going to let Tobi jump in here on the conflict of interest. She had a comment. I'm just going to turn my audio off.
To further on what Andrea was saying about a council member being on the organized hamlet board and sitting on council at the same time, there's actually in some RMs where the organized hamlet is its own division and where that council member by default is on that board. So just to further on what Andrea was saying, it's just appropriate then when a meeting comes up to make sure you are properly declaring when it could be, when it's appropriate there. Or inappropriate, yeah. That's all I had to add.
This is Lynn Sass. I have a question. Are you?
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead,
I'm sorry. Well, I'm certainly not as close to the RM and organized hamlet relationship as my president, Gary Dixon, is, so I don't want to cut him off if he's got more questions. But one of the things I've noticed is 59 out of the 144 organized hamlets in the province, or very close to that, are cottage communities. That's about 41% of your organized hamlets that are cottage communities. And occasionally I have found in consultation with organized hamlets that they only live and breathe for about 4 months. And that is simply because they're a cottage community and the people who serve on their board are only there during cottage months. Now, that's not the case in many cottages. Many cottages are year-round, and certainly with the numbers requirements, most of them would be. But I knew some times when I would try to get a hold of an organized hamlet board in the late fall or early spring, it was very difficult. Has that come up in your discussions?
Certainly. I think, and we do want to see a bit more rigor, I guess. By treating the organized hamlet like a board, we're saying you need to function as a board. That means having more than one meeting in a year, for example, and having people who are actually committed to being board members for more than a couple months in the summer. So one of the things we've discussed is that, you know, some of the existing organized hamlets might take a look at these new rules and say, you know, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to be an organized hamlet anymore. Like, it is a lot of work, but you're adding value, but you're putting a lot in to get that value out of it, right? So, you know, there might not be room for those barely functioning boards anymore with these new regulations. And Tobi's going to talk about that in a little bit, about what other options might be looked at by some communities, because it might have made sense for them to be an organized hamlet when they're established. Maybe it doesn't make sense anymore. So that is something that we'll get to in a bit here after we're through questions about the OH board part of it.
Okay, I'll mute myself now.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a couple more people with their hands up. Brenda Ottenbright, you have your hand up. You can unmute yourself. Go ahead, Brenda. Are you there, Brenda? We can't hear you. She did type a question. What do you mean by OH participating in mill rate setting?
There is the option to have a lower mill rate in the organized hamlet. And so just to provide some clarity around that, we would put that in the agreement so that there's, you know, that's been discussed and agreed upon between the RM and the organized hamlet.
Okay. Yvette Hamilton, you had a question. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yes, actually, I noticed that in this proposal that you have implemented a possible 30 to 60 days in section 77. And I thank you so much for that, because that was one of our main disputes. The RM would not comply or provide us with anyone on their end. But a suggestion would also be to have the same type of a timeline for mediation. And the reason being is because the RM refused to join with us in mediation. And so at the end of the day, our legal bill for over a 10-month period was extremely high. We did come to a resolution with the RM. There was a change in council, thank goodness. But that would be one of my suggestions too.
Yeah, thanks, Yvette. And I do remember you mentioning some of this during the focus group. And so we've definitely kept that in mind, putting some more structure on that process and not allowing either party to stonewall it. And so there are some options for it to be referred to the Saskatchewan Municipal Board. And not that that's going to be a shorter timeline necessarily, but at least there will be action regardless of participation. And yeah, just establishing some firm timelines in terms of what needs to happen when. So that's definitely something that we've been diving into, and you don't see that detail in this discussion paper, but that detail will be in the proposed wording that we plan to distribute.
Okay, because I also attended, when I attended your parks meeting, there was a gentleman there that actually actively does mediation, and there was no charge for that. And so that's something too that I think should be passed on to RMs and organized hamlets, because he's an incredible source.
Well, that's good. We have been talking with a few different parties that do mediation, including the Dispute Resolution Office within government. There certainly are resources, and even though there is some cost to what we've been looking at, it's much more affordable than court for sure.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have another question here. What is the proposed timing for the new legislation? When would it take effect, and how long would the hamlet boards and RMs have to put the policies and agreements in place?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Part of that just depends on the feedback we get right now during consultation and how many issues we, we think we've resolved a lot of issues, but there might be more raised that might take some more time to work through. But my hope is to have new regulations by fairly early in 2023, and then there would be time to comply to implement. And so what we're looking at now, what we think might be reasonable, is to have maybe 6 months after your next annual general meeting. So that means any OH that has an annual general meeting in summer, 6 months after that, they would expect it to have their policies in place and an agreement with the RM. Something like that. This is very much still, under discussion. So that could be part of the feedback as well, is what makes sense for a timeline for implementation.
Okay, I see Bradley, you have your hand up. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. And I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm glad that you were here. Just quickly, we've got a really good relationship with RM right now. In fact, we have a written agreement in place, which may even go farther than the regulations allow. But anyhow, just my question is, because the Hamlet Board technically isn't a legal entity and it's signing an agreement with a legal entity, how does that work? And secondly, RM councils change, and do you anticipate these written agreements to continue to be binding as time goes on?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a legal entity, but the organized hamlet is established by a minister's order. And it certainly has been a party to legal disputes So maybe that's just something we need to dig into a bit more. Maybe you could send me more information on what your experience with that has been, so that we can make sure that that it's applying as we intend.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine. I just knew that normally the RM has to sign contracts and
oh yes, that's
that
because they're
type
the
of thing.
governing body.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
that would continue, but there might be some delegation within the authority provided by the regulations, and if that delegation would be covered in the agreement, so that it's clear what's being delegated and how.
Excellent. And what about a time frame to these written agreements? As the RM Council changes, as the board changes, will it take both parties to agree if the agreement needs to be amended, or how do you see that happening?
Yeah, so that would be part of the agreement itself, just as typically is included in agreements. So the processes for amending it and a dispute resolution.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, Brandy, you had your hand up. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Andrea, I think you guys did a great job on the discussion report from our focus groups. One of the concerns I have in relation to the regulatory framework would be, again, the agreements. So some of us RMs who have 10, 13 hamlets, having a different agreement for each and every hamlet could really affect our resources and how much time we spend trying to ensure that the agreements are being upheld. The policies are in place on the RM side. Now, is there any type of, and Toby might hit on this later, if regulations would determine, you say, their AGM, their annual report, voter eligibility, is there anything in there that might cause them to be non-compliant and then would no longer qualify as, say, an organized hamlet? Or is that strictly up to the RM in order to manage to ensure that they are in compliance with all the regulations?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the first one, I would say, I would definitely look into the possibility of having one agreement that all organized hamlets are signatory to, unless you have unique agreements. I mean, I remember that in RMs such as yourselves, where there's a lot of organized hamlets, they're all generally treated the same way. So if that could be done under one agreement, that would certainly help you out. But I think we'll leave that. We wouldn't specify there has to be one agreement with each OH. The second one was, the status of the organized hamlet. So in the Act, an RM is allowed to request that organized hamlet be dissolved if there's no longer an active hamlet board. And so that's in place in the Act. We wouldn't be looking at amending that. But what we would be doing is saying, okay, well, let's define an active hamlet board. An active hamlet board has policies that they're required to have and has an agreement with the RM. At the same time, we wouldn't allow the RM to say, well, we're not going to sign an agreement so that we can request that, to get rid of the organized hamlet. That wouldn't be allowed either. That would be that would be basically be considered as a dispute.
Yeah.
So that mechanism would remain, and the province isn't going to start policing essentially all of these organized hamlets. We're going to put the requirements in place, and if things are not working well, I guess that would be the first thing to look at is, are the requirements being met or not? And then there's options there. But of course, Toby will talk in a bit too, but of course advisory services is always a great resource to for advice about what should be happening, and whether what options there are if things are not working. The options, regulations, or the Act. Do you want to add any more about that now?
Okay. Sherry, Jimmy, you had your hand up. Did you have a question? You're self-muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting it. Just to further on what Andrea was saying, I do think currently, without having it right in front of me, one of the requirements are that they have their AGM. And then I think to further that, if the requirements, the regulations require 4 meetings annually, that would be one of the benchmarks that would be looked at as well. Are they completing what they're required to do, those bare minimums? That's all I had to input on that.
Okay. Yvette Hamilton, you had another question?
Yes, with regard to voter eligibility, one of the dilemmas that we ran into as a Hamlet board, we're not privy to the ratepayers list as to who actually is a ratepayer and who is not a ratepayer. So that makes it very difficult for us when it comes to election time. I did have a short conversation with Mike Morris at one point with regard to this, and as far as them raising their hands, you know, that is left to the ratepayers on the floor at the time. I personally, well, I mean, as a board, if we are run more like a municipality, I think it would make it easier, and there would be some very clear, defined, it would make it a lot easier for us as a board to know who is eligible to vote and who isn't. I'm not certain why as a Hamlet board, because we do act on behalf of the ratepayers, and I do understand through the Privacy Act that we aren't privy to that information, but it would make life a little bit easier for us if we knew exactly who was eligible as a voter and who wasn't. I mean, as far as who owns this house or who owns that. Now, I do know we do have access through land titles. We can access it at no cost, but unless you know everyone living in the hamlet and how long they have been there, that could be quite a timely thing. And actually it was for us to discover who was eligible and who wasn't eligible to vote.
Okay, thanks. We'll definitely take those comments and look into it a bit more. I would just comment though, when you say being run more like a municipality, I think that's kind of when we get into some of this territory of confusion, right? It's the organized hamlet isn't a municipality, and therefore we actually are not going to put the same rigor around elections. We will say, you know, you have to be an eligible voter, but in terms of how the elections are run, like the Local Government Election Act is way over the top for an organized hamlet board. And so that will actually be up to the organized hamlet itself. Do we want to just keep going with a show of hands? Do we want to have a secret ballot? Do you want to have a virtual annual meeting and do some sort of virtual voting? Really, we're not going to regulate too far into that, and it's just what makes sense for the organized hamlet. And so yeah, that's one of the areas where we thought, you know, this is all over the place, and it doesn't really make sense for us to be stipulating exactly how you need to do your election.
I understand completely.
Okay, Toby had another comment too, so. Please hear it. There we go.
Perfect. Hi, I'm just going to chime in a little bit about that ratepayers list you were talking about the organized hamlet not having access to it. The Local Government Election Act was amended back in 2019, I believe. 1819. And actually, it's that section itself was repealed. So there's actually no authority even in the RM to have those voters list or the ratepayers list accessible. They're not accessible to anyone. So unless your municipality does like a voters list, and I do not know of any municipalities that really do that, it's up to the candidates themselves to campaign, door knock, however they see fit. So I just wanted to add that little piece in, that that's not accessible to anyone any longer.
Okay, I'm not sure if you've answered this one yet or not. How can OH meetings be invitational when all council meetings are public?
So that's one of the things that we'll clarify. The annual general meeting is public to all residents of the organized hamlet. But the OH board meetings themselves would be board meetings. So when you think about how boards function, they're not actually public meetings. So they could have invited guests, and they are going to be taking minutes from those meetings, but they're not a governing body. It's not a public meeting in the same way that a municipal council must have public meetings. And so yeah, it is different because it is more in line with that board model. It's a bit of a blend though, right? Because the minutes are public, publicly available documents. Does that make sense? Some of this will be a little bit clearer once the draft wording has been developed. But yeah, I guess that's the distinction. Is it a board? You know, is it the OH board acting as a board, or is it the RM council acting as the governing body? And then you'll see distinctions that way.
Okay, Yvette, you had your hand up again, I see. Did you have another question? And this will be the last one.
Yeah, as far as the meetings were concerned, we actually do meet every month, but it's not publicly, it's just our board themselves. And most of that is to sign off on our requisitions and discuss everything. We like to keep on track and we look ahead a couple of years. Our only meeting that we do have public would be our AGM. We do meet in private homes. We don't have a chamber like an RM. So because of that reason also, it's very difficult for us to invite anyone to our meetings. So yeah, I think the way it's structured right now with AGM as being mandatory works really well at this point.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay.
So I think we can come back to more questions about this after Tobi's done her part of the presentation as well. Just so you know, Chelsea and I will still be here if there's further discussion later.
Okay, Tobi, you are now the presenter.
It doesn't look like Tobi can hear us.
Hear me okay?
There you go.
There's Tobi.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to segue into special service areas. And Lynn, this is what Andrea was referring to that I'm going to speak a bit towards. Or was it Lynn? I think it was Lynn who was commenting that their organized hamlet is really only active within 4 months, and the other 8 months of the year, there's really minimal going on, and they might not be able to keep up with the proposed regulations. So if that's the case, I want to speak about special service areas. So previous to the amendments that were done to the legislation, to the Municipalities Act back in 2020, special service areas were only created at times of restructuring. So when for example, when a village became part of an RM, okay, that's when typically they would be set up as a special service area. Now, since the amendments went through in 2020, they could be established at any time, but by minister's order. So the purpose of a special service area is twofold. It gives council the ability to provide different services or different levels of services within this defined area, and to be able to apply different taxes, including tax tools, to this defined area. Like I was saying, it's set up by minister's order, so there is a process that I will talk about. And then ultimately, if the application is reviewed and agreed upon, there will be a minister's order creating this special service area. I'm going to go to my next slide. I can't really see that. See that? Perfect. So the application of the process to establish a special service area is not defined in legislation. But what we will require would be a resolution to initiate the process. And then once that's done, you need to have a defined area. It can't just be outlined in red. It would have to be a set area, and advisory services would be happy to work with you on this. The biggest thing here is public consultation. Council will need to, or would be required to conduct public consultation stating they are considering creating a special service area. Council will be expected to present to the public the reasons for the proposal, including a map showing the affected area. And the various options of public consultation exist, but they're not limited to. So the examples that we give are advertised in the newspaper, your social media, your websites, general mail outs, open house public meeting, giving the public the opportunity to ask questions, to see the area, just to find out more information as to why this is being set up. Once the public consultation is finished, council then would have the decision whether or not to proceed or not. And if they choose to proceed, they would pass a resolution. And then all of this would be forwarded onto the ministry for consideration. So the ministry will review all the information and determine whether or not to have it created as a special service area. And the minister may require additional information if he is not satisfied at the point that enough public consultation was done. To date, we've only had one special service area created, other than at restructuring. So this is still new to us as well. What I really want to hit home is a special service area is not an organized hamlet. Legislation, like Andrea was talking about earlier, requires organized hamlets to elect a board, which has specific legislative duties and responsibilities, such as establishing budgets and AGMs. There are also thresholds to be created as a special service area, or sorry, to be created as an organized hamlet. For a special service area, there are no thresholds. There's no minimum population that you have to have. There's no taxable assessment or number of dwellings. It's just an area that requires most likely different levels of service or additional service and different taxing options. So that essentially is a special service area. What I also wanted to touch base on, because I know there is confusion out there, hamlets versus organized hamlets. And we hear a lot of people refer to them as unorganized hamlets, which is fine as well. So an unorganized hamlet is an area within the municipality, within the RM, and it's by definition, for the most part. There must be at least 5 occupied dwellings situated on lots, blocks, or parcels, and at least 10 subdivided lots, blocks, or parcels, the majority of which are an average size of less than 1 acre. There are also hamlets out there that have been established by minister's order, most likely at a time of restructuring. They probably are a bit older, and they may not meet the current definitions of a hamlet. But if that is the case, and they have been defined or designated by minister's order as a hamlet, you would need to have those, basically that minister's order, canceled. There we go. That was a big word. And so again, it's very similar to the process to have a special service area established. It's just going backwards now. So a resolution to look at having the hamlet reverted to just an area within the RM. That would be the first step. There would also need to be public consultation on that. Why is council considering this? And then after the public consultation, it would be again a resolution of council to proceed with having this hamlet reverted back into just an area, and that would be submitted to the ministry as well for review. How are we doing on time? Okay. We were also asked to talk about the different areas within the Ministry of Government Relations. So I'm going to go through this relatively fast, and really is who to call and when to call them. So within the ministry itself, there are a lot of different branches and areas, but probably the main branches that you will be talking to would be advisory services, the municipal relations, building and technical standards, community planning, and municipal infrastructure and finance. I'm not going to get into the roles and responsibilities of each branch, but what I want to really touch on is keywords that you might hear, so it might help you better know who to call. So for building and technical standards, some of those keywords out there that you might hear: the Construction Code Act, building bylaws, building code, fire and electrical code, permits such as building, demolition, renovation, or moving a building. If any of those words are coming up in your questions, you need to give building and technical standards a call at the slide previous. And Lynn, I think you're going to share these as well once we're done. I'll send you a copy of this PowerPoint so everyone has this information. Community planning is also...
Yes, I will share them.
Excellent, thank you. Community planning, I believe most people need to talk to at some point, and their keywords, anytime you're talking about the Planning and Development Act, public hearings, development permits, setbacks, service and development agreements, annexation, dedicated lands, such as public or municipal reserves, and boat launches. Municipal infrastructure and finance, everybody likes them because they deal with the money. Grants, I mean. So keywords, when you know to call them, would be audited financial statements, your mill rate returns, waterworks and reporting, grants, your community component, building fund, and your ISIP. They oversee those. And anything to do with your financial reserves. And this is my branch itself. And again, there are many keywords here, so I'm just going to go to the next slide. And basically everything else you call us. Anything to deal with bylaws, governance, council, elections, conflict of interest, code of ethics, streets and roads, such as closures, restructuring, division boundary changes, assessment, taxation and tax enforcement, and public utilities. So I kind of went through that relatively fast, but if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to call myself or another advisor at the inquiry line listed here. So I'm going to turn it back to questions if anyone has any other questions, whether it's regarding the proposed regulations regarding organized hamlets or anything to do with this slide.
Yvette, you had a hand up. Did you have a question?
That may have been someone else in my team. There's myself, our chairman, Tom, and there's also our other board member, Heather, who is on.
Okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't me. So if it's one of them,
All right.
I'm hoping. Yeah.
Bradley, I see you have your hand up, or it might have been up from before.
Yeah, no, I have a question if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
2 points that have caused us trouble in the past. One was, and I'm just curious whether the new regulations might address this. One was the RM applying for grants for population-based grants based on the population, or including the population of the OH, and the OH not seeing any of those funds. I was wondering if you had thought to address that.
In the regulations,
Yes.
Yeah, no, at this point, I don't believe that has been considered.
Yeah, it was mainly the community building fund, the old gas tax. I mean, the RM used you know, the population, the total RM population for years, and unbeknownst to the OH that who was not receiving any of that any of those monies. So that would be a concern going forward. And the other one was in the new regulations, are you anticipating clarifying the role of invoices and bills being paid? In other words, can the RM access the OH account without to pay it, you know, for whatever reason, you know, to pay monies out without the OH's approval?
I'll put on mute and let you.
I have the best, I'm not sure I have the best answers for you, but I'll I have a few thoughts. The first with the grants. Grants are addressed under the Municipal Grants Act, and so they would not be covered in this legislation. But I would comment that the OH is, of course, part of the organized hamlet, so OH is part of the RM. So it is not its own entity. So, you know, I have no involvement with populations for grant purposes, but my initial reaction would be, you know, that you would not take out part of the population of the RM. But again, this is absolutely not my area, so I'm not going to say much more about that. With the second one, with the budget and expenditures, so the expenditures that can come out of the Hamlet account are ones that are in the budget as approved, and that is in the Act itself. So if there's needs to be more clarity in how those expenditures happen, and in consultation maybe before expenditures happen, maybe there's an emergency, for example, and in the Hamlet, and it makes sense to make an expenditure from the Hamlet account to deal with that emergency. That's the sort of thing you could put in an agreement, so that there's protocols around how that would happen if there's any expenditures that happen outside of the approved budget. Does that make sense?
So in this case, the agreement might clarify that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So there's no obligation in your mind when the RM is using, like our ROH is 25% of the RM's population, and you think there's no onus on the RM to address that when it's applying for grants. It can just use our numbers, but not actually ever tell us so, or actually not ever attribute some of the monies to us.
Well, of course, everyone in the everyone in the OH lives in the RM, right? And so the RM Council is making decisions for the RM as a whole, and they should be considering their entire population, everyone who lives in the municipality, whether they live in an organized hamlet or not. That's what I would say should be the general principle.
Yeah, no, general principle versus practice. Yeah, I understand, because it's clear that the municipal grant is split according to population and given directly to the OH budget. I'm just curious why some of these other grants don't have that same requirement.
Yeah, and I really have no background or knowledge about that.
Okay, thank you.
That's one of the things that Toby mentioned, municipal infrastructure and finance. Of course, they are the ones who have responsibility for those grant programs. So maybe if you have further questions about how the grant programs work, then that might be a better place to ask, because they have much more knowledge in that area than I do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have another question here. What happens if an OH wants to expand?
Okay. We're just going back and forth, so I just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead, Toby.
Okay, excellent. Essentially, if an organized hamlet wants to expand their boundaries, it's essentially an annexation. You would need to work with the RM Council to expand those boundaries. Now, our community planning branch, they are the experts behind that, and that's who you would need to talk to about the process there. But great question.
Okay. And Yvette, you've got your hand up again, so.
There we are. Had trouble unmuting. The last gentleman that was on, he had mentioned if the RM could take funds without approval of the Hamlet board. That was part of our dispute with the RM at the time. They were unilaterally removing funds. There are provisions within the Act that says in agreement with, and so both parties, this is what I learned through our dispute, both parties must be in agreement. So I just thought I would clarify that.
Much appreciated. Thanks, Yvette.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think that might be it.
All right, well, I thank you very much for inviting us today. And Lynn, we will get copies of our presentations to you so you can disperse them. And again, if anyone has any other questions, please don't hesitate to give myself, Andrea, Chelsea, or the appropriate branch a call.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I know President Gary may be coming online to say thank you, but if he's not, I'm getting my thanks in first, because we had you folks jumping first, second, and third, and then I was forgetting this thing, and you were very patient. Thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
Yes, on behalf of myself and the Board of Directors from Parks, thank you very much for offering this presentation. I think I can just tell by the number of questions that it is a point of, I shouldn't say contention, but it's something that sounds like of interest to everyone. So thank you to Andrea, Chelsea, and Toby for answering the questions and a great presentation. Hope to hear from you also.
Thank you, Gary. And I'll just remind people, if you have written comments, we'd love to have them.